Firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's 2025 World Social Justice Day Human Rights webinar. Whatever we speak about today is going to have a great impact on the future of human rights in Australia as a whole. So to start us off, I'd like to invite Yolanda to give us an acknowledgement of country.
Hi, everyone. So, as we are gathered here today, I'd like to pay respects to the Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and acknowledge their continuing contribution and connection to their land, which has belonged to them for over 60,000 years. I would like to honor the traditional custodians of this land, past, present, and emerging, and recognize that this country always has and always will be Aboriginal land. It is important we acknowledge the first Australians at this webinar today, as they are one of the most vulnerable groups to human rights violations since Australia's colonisation. And it is important that we work to protect, preserve, support, and also listen to their stories and customs to continue passing them on to the next generation. I would also like to extend an invitation to everyone here to write in the chat the traditional name of the land of which you are joining us today. For me, I'm currently joining from Ngunnawal land. If you are unsure of the Aboriginal name of the land you come from, I encourage you to educate yourself and become familiar with your region's unique traditional customs, language, and culture. With that said, I would like to invite our Perth YEO Miranda to speak. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Yolanda. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, and welcome to YCW's Human Rights webinar. My name is Miranda, and I am the Youth Engagement Officer for Perth. It's truly an honour to have you all join us for this very important and thought-provoking conversation. Today, we come together to explore the vital issue of human rights in Australia, an issue that touches the lives of every individual and shapes the very fabric of our society. This is a space where we'll dive into the challenges, opportunities, and actions we can take to ensure a more just, equal, and inclusive Australia for us all. Our conversation today will be guided by an incredible panel of experts who bring a wealth of experience and insight to the table. As we dive into today's discussion, I encourage you all to engage, ask questions, and think about how we as a society can better advocate for human rights and make a real, equal, lasting impact. We are so excited to have you with us for this important event, and I will now hand over to Sudeep to introduce each of our panelists.
Thank you, Miranda. Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sudeep, and I'm the National Secretary of the YCW, a current high school student and one of your hosts tonight. Joining me tonight in hosting is Yolanda, the YCW representative from Canberra, and I welcome everyone to the Social Justice Day discussion on a Federal Bill of Rights, and a special welcome to our amazing panelists who agreed to be here tonight and be a part of this amazing event. We're absolutely delighted and extremely privileged to have such a diverse and experienced group of panelists tonight. All of our panelists today are committed to having a meaningful discussion tonight, and I'm confident that their insights will leave us all with much to reflect on. As we dive into today's discussion, I encourage all of you to engage, pop questions in the chat, and think about how we, as a society, can better advocate for human rights and make a real lasting impact. We are so excited to have you here with us for tonight's webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we go on. I'd like to let you know that attendees will be popping in and out throughout this webinar as it is public. And so you may see different names coming through and going out. Regardless, we'll be going through our agenda as usual. So I'd just like to share our agenda really quickly with everyone. We'll be starting off with introductions and then an aim to the webinar, before going into an opening reflection regarding the context of the Human Rights Act. Then we'll have a formal introduction of the panelists where they can tell us a little bit about themselves before following it up with a panelist interview. Then we will have a negotiation with panelists and commitments in regards to efforts to pass a Bill of Rights federally. Following that will be a question time within which audience can ask questions, and we'll end off and close this webinar by 8 p.m. tonight, Sydney time. Another bit of housekeeping, everyone's mics except the host and the panelists will be on mute throughout the duration of this webinar. Please direct questions in the chat and we'll address them during Q&A. And also, we ask you to please stay respectful as we understand this is a politically charged event and that there are different sentiments regarding the passing of a human rights bill. That being said, I'd like to hand over to Yolanda to begin today's discussion. Thank you again for being here.
Hi everyone, my name is Yolanda. As Sudeep said before, I'll be co-hosting this webinar along with him. Firstly, I want to say that despite inviting many politicians here today, most declined our invitation to an open conversation. As many of you saw, Senator Lidia Thorpe was meant to join us today, but she had to pull out due to a family matter. However, we are really honored to have Senator Payman join us in order to gain insight on why we do not have a human rights legislation, why we should have one, and also how we can make this happen in Australia practically, efficiently, and justly. Despite being a first world country that has signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we as a nation do not have a national bill of rights legally protecting most rights stated in the UDHR. Ensuring we have a human rights legislation in Australia means that victims of human rights violations are able to find a clearer path to justice under one law, and also forces the government to be held accountable when implementing other policies by considering its implications on our human rights. This legislation would also aid in educating the public about our basic human rights and ensuring they are protected legally. Through political insights and open discussion, this webinar seeks to inform, engage, and empower participants to actively follow and contribute to the ongoing conversations surrounding human rights legislation and motivate politicians who are here and not in attendance also to commit to passing a federal act of human rights in Parliament. A human rights bill in Australia is of utmost importance in our courts of law to secure the protection of our basic rights. So here I've also got a quote just for a bit of a reflection, and it says, "A right is not what someone gives you, it's what no one can take from you," which was said by Ramsey Clark, who is a human rights lawyer and former Attorney General. I just wanted to share this quote to get everyone to reflect on what it means to you and just to understand the very raw human necessity to have rights available to us. With that being said, I'd also like to share a bit of context about how we came up with this webinar. Originally, myself and Sudhi were championing or in charge of making an action within the YCW about Human Rights Day. And we also found out that Taylor was championing Social Justice Day. And we thought we could merge our actions to be in this one webinar. Sudeep found that there was a petition for Amnesty International, where we have a representative here today on our panel, to propel a Human Rights Act in Australia. And we thought this was perfect for the issue we were advocating for. So Sudeep spent a very long time emailing various politicians around Australia, and we got an amazing social media team who were putting up posts on Instagram and making posters. We also spent a really long time planning, writing scripts, finalizing agendas, and myself and Taylor wrote up the questions for our panel, and Sudeep will be doing the negotiation part of the webinar also. But basically, that's kind of how we got to where we are tonight. And we're so glad to have such an amazing response from the politicians and advocates on our panel and all the people joining in the audience. So I guess now I'll just hand over to Sudeep to introduce all the panelists.
Thank you, Yolanda. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce the panelists, but I'd also like to invite them to quickly introduce themselves as well. I'd like to preface this by saying that unfortunately, Senator Thorpe, who was going to be here with us tonight, cancelled this morning due to family issues. However, we are blessed to have Senator Payman, founder of Australia's Voice Party, join us today, helping out the YCW in the last minute. First, we have Nikita White, the lead campaigner for a federal human rights act at Amnesty International. She's a passionate advocate for human rights, equality, and social justice. Nikita has been at the forefront of various initiatives, tirelessly working to defend the rights of those whose voices often go unheard. Her experience and advocacy efforts make her an invaluable voice in discussion. Would you like to introduce yourself, Nikita?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I am joining from Turrbal and Yagaraland up here in Meanjin or Brisbane. And yes, as you mentioned, I'm the lead campaigner at Amnesty on our campaign for Human Rights Act, which means I work with all my colleagues in Australia, as well as colleagues who work with people around the world who have human rights acts in their country to advocate for the protection of human rights. And at Amnesty International, we've advocated for a Human Rights Act for a really long time. And I'm really excited to, as part of that campaign, to be here talking with you tonight.
Thank you, Nikita. Next, we have Senator Payman, an independent senator from Western Australia since 2022. She is the first hijab-wearing Muslim senator in Australia. Born in Afghanistan, she advocates for workers' rights, multicultural communities, and social justice, often addressing issues of equity and representation in politics. Recently, towards the end of 2024, she's also founded the Australia's Voice Party. Senator Payman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Steve. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. It's only 3 p.m. here in Western Australia for us, but I too would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respects to their elders. This is such an incredible opportunity for me to join in, and even though it's last minute, I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation because you won't believe it. I was actually having a meeting earlier today with the Australian Human Rights Commission exactly about this bill. So it was almost like this weird moment of coincidence that this invitation came up, and I was grateful that I could move things around to be part of the conversation. As Sudeep mentioned, the last year in particular has been tumultuous and quite the experience. I've experienced a lot of things firsthand, which actually indicates why we need a Human Rights Act or a Bill of Rights Act in a Western democracy, being the only Western democracy that actually doesn't have one. So clearly here to champion and hear from all the other panelists, including the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Payman. Next, I'd like to introduce Darren Dick, the Senior Policy Advisor at the Australian Human Rights Centre. The Australian Human Rights Commission. Darren brings a wealth of knowledge on policy development and its intersection with human rights. His extensive experience in shaping strategies that protect and promote the rights of individuals across Australia make him a key figure in this important conversation. Darren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sudeep. I'm joining you from Gadigal land here on the unceded lands of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Yes, I'm at the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'm the Senior Policy Executive at the Commission, which essentially means all of the commissioners and the work program of the Commission is sort of managed by me. A key piece of work that Nikita's been very involved in over the years is we ran a project called Free and Equal for the past 4.5 years, and the centrepiece of that project was the development of a model National Human Rights Act, and that's now been endorsed through the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, which we'll no doubt talk about more, and we're in a very good position to be able to push through on getting a National Human Rights Act. So I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about it, and fantastic we've been doing a lot of advocacy with members of Parliament, and fantastic to know that Senator Payman, that you were meeting with our President earlier today. I've been in some of those meetings, but not all of them. So it's good to hear.
Thank you very much, Darren. That's absolutely awesome. We actually started this conversation after looking into the Joint Parliamentary Committee's inquiry, which is also why we initially had Senator Lidia Thorpe, who's on that inquiry, agree to join us. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Taylor Cowley, the National YCS representative to the YCW. Taylor is a passionate young woman with aspiration to inspire change for the betterment of society. She has and continues to do so through her various youth leadership and advocacy positions. Taylor will be the youth representative on the panel, bringing a younger and more diverse and different set of views to the conversation. Taylor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, it's lovely to be here. I'm joining from Darugland, so I want to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I am currently a student in year 12, so my resume isn't quite as impressive as some of our other panelists, but I am a very passionate advocate, especially in the space of human rights and international law. So yeah, it's a really amazing opportunity to be here, and thank you so much, YCW, for having me.
Thank you, Taylor. With that, I'd like to pass on to Yolanda to start off our panelist interviews.
Awesome. Thank you, Sudeep. And thank you to all the panelists for introducing yourselves. Again, really honored to have you all here with us today. So I'll get started. There's around 4 questions, which I'll ask to everyone, to each of the panelists. And then I've got a question each, just specifically for each panelist after that. So I'll start with the first one. Should human rights be protected? And if yes, what are some of the fundamental human rights that you believe should be protected under this law?
Maybe we can start off with Nikita White.
Yeah.
Hey, happy to. I don't think it will surprise anyone that my answer to this question is yes. We at Amnesty International, but also as a person, I'm obviously very passionate about protecting our fundamental human rights. And that is why we've been campaigning for a really long time for a Human Rights Act. You know, in Australia today, we have a really patchwork system of human rights protections. Some people's right to live free from discrimination is protected, and we have implied freedoms in the Constitution, like the implied freedom of political communication, but we don't have a Human Rights Act like so many other countries do that protects all our human rights, including rights like the right to health, to housing, education. So that is why we are advocating for a Human Rights Act. What we want to see in human rights, we will often divide, for lack of a better word, human rights into civil and political rights and to economic, social, and cultural rights. And something that we've been advocating for, as has, the Human Rights Commission and many other organizations, is to ensure that economic, social, and cultural rights are included in a Human Rights Act. There is a lot of support for civil and political rights, although not universal support for civil and political rights or for a Human Rights Act. But what we believe, and I think it's really obvious, particularly for young people, but for so many people in Australia, is that people are suffering abuses to their economic, social, and cultural rights right now, and particularly when you look at things like the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the fact that healthcare is increasingly unaffordable. And this is why we believe it's really important that the Human Rights Act, if we get one, that it includes not only civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. The other rights I wanted to mention that we believe should be included, obviously cultural rights, the rights particular to First Nations people, that are in the international human rights treaties that Australia has signed. And one thing that is really a really important part of a Human Rights Act and human rights is the requirement to consult with communities that are impacted by decisions. And so the draft Human Rights Act and proposition by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, it includes economic, social, cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. And we really welcome that. It also includes particular rights for consultation with young people, people with disabilities, and Indigenous people. And we think it's really important that young people, people with disabilities, Indigenous people are consulted by government when making decisions that impact them. And I think that's a really big thing that a Human Rights Act could achieve for young people that's not in our current laws, and that could really better how decisions are made that impact young people in this country.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikita. I guess we can move to Senator Payman if you'd like to share your views.
Nikita pretty much addressed a lot of the points. I just wanted to make a few, expand on a few points Nikita made, but essentially when it comes to political rights, it's important for us to be continuously advocating for the freedom of protest and assembly. Being able to have our voices heard and our concerns elevated to those in power without the fear of punishment. I mean, in the last 14, 15 months, we've seen that, whether it's for Invasion Day, whether it's for, the pro-Palestinian rallies we're seeing, there's always been this fear associated with wanting to raise your concerns or be part of it, because that might, people have said things like, we're scared that our employers might fire us, we might be intimidated at work or singled out. So these are real concerns and fears that people shouldn't have to have if their rights were protected. Also, freedom from arbitrary detention. And those of you who may have followed federal politics quite closely, last year in November, they passed the 3 draconian bills, or the Labor government did with the help of the coalition in the Senate, which essentially just really impinged on the freedoms and rights of refugees and asylum seekers. And one of them in particular would subject refugees to be deported to third world countries where their security and safety and the upholding of their human rights was not guaranteed. And that's where I think, as a first world country, as a democratic country, Australia has moral obligations to comply to what international law stipulates, and for us to be those champions, not be selective with the way we treat human rights of one population over another.
Wow, thank you so much, Senator Payman. That was amazing. I guess I'll ask Darren Dick if you'd like to jump in response to the question as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think the starting point is you go back to a document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the sort of the great statements of humanity. And what it's very clear is that everybody's entitled to human rights for no reason other than that they're human beings, and that those rights are universal and they're indivisible. So that means that everybody should have access and protection for all of their rights. So I don't think there's any basis upon which you can say some rights should be protected and other rights should not. It goes against the basic tenet of what rights are, which is universal protections, minimum standards and protections for and aspirations for everybody. In the work that we've done, the Free and Equal projects, if you look up Human Rights Commission Free and Equal, you'll see a number of reports. They all look a bit like this. And you'll also see diagram like this one, which lists all the rights that we think should be in a Human Rights Act. So I won't go through that in detail, but it is, as Nikita said, it's the civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights. In our model, what we've also done is we've drawn out, looking at the decisions and the interpretation of these rights by various UN committees like the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. We've articulated a specific additional right around the right to a healthy environment. Now that sits fundamentally within protections of a right to an adequate standard of health and an adequate standard of living and to sanitation and various other things as well. But we think it's worth also pulling out as its own distinct right given the climate crisis that we're living through. So we've suggested that be included as well, and is something that I think is well recognised as sitting within the universal human rights that we're all entitled to. I think what I would say, there's two or three points I'd make about it is we started this work, this major national piece of work a few years ago because our concern was that rights are not protected well enough in Australia and we need to do better. And as an example of that, if you look to our discrimination laws, for example, racial discrimination laws were introduced in 1975, sex discrimination laws in 1983. They've barely changed. This is 40, 50 years ago, and they reflect the standards that existed at that time. They don't reflect contemporary standards. And our protections simply haven't kept pace with what we need in the community. And we've seen that particularly at times like COVID. Who'd ever thought you'd live in a country that would lock its citizens out for extended periods of time, and there would be absolutely no recourse for citizens to get back to the country when they've got family members dying, when they need to access emergency medical treatment and the like. But that's exactly what happened in COVID, for example. It's certainly in the UDHR, the right of people, freedom of movement and liberty to return to their own country as well. But that's just one example of why we need it. As Nikita said, to one other thing that the Commission in our work we've added to the conversation is that we think that there are certain groups in the community where there are human rights obligations that talk about ensuring their full participation in decisions that affect them. So particularly children, Indigenous communities, people with disability. And if we look, the work we do, we advise the federal government on how it can improve human rights. Consistently for us, the key failing for people with disability, Indigenous peoples and children is that they are not included in the conversation on decisions that affect their lives. And so we've included in our model a requirement, a duty on government and government officials that they must ensure that participation when they're making laws that are going to directly affect children, people with disability and Indigenous peoples. And we think that would go to a key failing of government at this point as well, and that a Human Rights Act has a really serious and important role to play in kind of elevating the way laws and policies are made and ensuring those voices are heard, but then also meaning that at the beginning of a process, the human rights impact of laws are thought about, because that's what doesn't happen enough. And Senator Payman, I'm sure, can talk extensively to that. It's very difficult once a bill is in a parliament that basically breaches human rights in ways that are not justifiable to get it changed. And the obligation should be on politicians, public servants developing legislation. The first time they think about making new law, how does this impact on people's human rights? How do we prevent breaching people's human rights? And that's what Human Rights Act does.
Wow, thank you so much for that response. I guess that leaves us with Taylor, if you'd like to share your views as a young person on this question.
I would just echo pretty much all the points of my fellow panelists. I would like to also, note that the nature of human rights means that they're inherent, indivisible, universal, and inalienable, which means that these human rights can't be segregated as some that should be protected and some that shouldn't. And I think that it's a really important point that these rights all need to be protected to prevent a violation of human rights in the future, as these rights belong to all of us, just simply because we're human. I think I'd also like to place emphasis on the previous points made about rights which would be able to protect the consultation between Parliament and groups which these bills are actually affecting. And I think that it's really important. And as Darren Dick mentioned, it's a really big failing of Parliament, their refusal to actually consult groups on issues and laws which will affect them. So yeah, that's pretty much me just echoing my fellow panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your answers. It was amazing to see what you think about this. I'll move on to the next question now, which is, where do you think young people fall into this issue and how a Bill of Rights would affect them? I think I'd honestly like to hear from Taylor first, just because she's a young person, and then we can go from there. That's okay with you, Taylor?
Yes, of course. Bill of Rights. There's a lot of different ways that this affects young people, in particular, in protecting their human rights. I'm a really passionate advocate for uplifting the voices of young people, and I feel like too often, really, in our society, we are not quite heard on issues that will obviously affect us, and it's really easy for these breaches of human rights to happen to children, as they sometimes don't have positions of authority, or they may feel intimidated by those who do have authority over them. So human rights violations are obviously really common in children when they're not being heard and actually properly taken care of. So looking at that concept of consulting young people within this process of creating a Bill of Rights, and then ensuring that we're protecting the rights of young people and their outreach into the community. I think that is, those are really the main things that a Bill of Rights would protect. And I think that that's a really important step specifically for young people.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. Um, I think we can hear from Nikita White again, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a youth advisory group at Amnesty International Australia, and we've been speaking to them a lot over the last few years about what they think about a Human Rights Act. And one thing that has really stood out to me in those conversations is the interconnectedness of the issues that young people are facing today. And I think that is really demonstrated by the cost of living crisis. This impacts people's right to healthcare, also to housing, and then young people are also facing a climate crisis, which will also impact people's right to housing. Where I live is right just a few streets down from where it floods in Brisbane, and we've been seeing more floods and people who, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had 3 once in 100-year floods that have made people move and they've lost their housing. And we're going to see more of that with the climate crisis. And so when I think about how young people fall into this issue, I think it is about acknowledging that the future, it feels uncertain at the moment. And a lot of the issues that are impacting young people are interconnected, and we need a tool. We talk about a Human Rights Act a lot at Amnesty as a tool because it allows people to take action to protect their human rights. And so people need a tool to take action, as well as putting an onus on government to consider human rights that will protect their human rights. And I think moving into that last part, and similar to what Taylor said, a really important part of human rights is acknowledging people as agents, and that young people and all people are agents of change and can take action to protect their human rights. And the consultation provision is one way that should be done, that we should recognize that young people have agency and should be consulted on decisions that impact them, but they should also be able to take action when their rights are violated, which is something people can't do in Australia currently. And in Queensland, we do have a Human Rights Act. It's not perfect, but we do have an act that covers the state government. And we have seen young people take approvals for coal mines to court and to challenge it on the basis of their human rights. And that has, led to the first time in Australia that a coal mine was recommended not to be approved because of the impacts on human rights. And so I think it is really important to acknowledge the agency of young people that was totally missing from the recent debate on the social media ban, I thought, and the need for them to be able to influence the issues that impact them.
Thank you so much, Nikita, for that response. I think I'd like to hear from Senator Payman, if that's all right with you.
Thank you. I was going to mention the social media ban because Australians out there only had 24 hours to put in submissions, and it was just outrageous that such a massive government overreach into the privacy of young people didn't warrant more than 24 hours of consultation. And I think when it comes to young people, aside from having their voices heard and at the table, that respect needs to be there, and recognition that nobody understands the experience of young people like young people themselves. And, a Bill of Rights would ensure that no matter who's in government, no matter what their politics is or what party's in power, that basic human rights will always be upheld, and that should go across the board to everyone. And young people in particular fall in this vulnerable category of, being young enough to be thrown in jail, but not young enough to vote or, old enough to vote or old enough to have social media. And I think one other thing I would like to add to that is the equality to the equality when it comes to education and employment rights, to ensure that there's protections put in place when it comes to young people working and having access to education that is affordable, accessible, and of the same standard, regardless of the postcode you're from. Just because you live in the regions or away from the metro region doesn't mean that the access you have to education is compromised. I know that the public, there was a massive campaign through the Australian Education Union calling for an increase in the funding that the government would have to give for public schools to match at least the quality of education that other schools may have, even though the funding would not be anywhere near the same as private schools. That being said, I'm not throwing shade at private schools. I'm just saying that there needs to be equity, and something that we don't often talk about is enforceability. Like, it's great to talk about a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act, but how do we make sure that it's enforceable to prevent human rights abuses, no matter who's perpetrating it, and it shouldn't be at the desire or whim of the government of the day.
That was a great response, Senator Payman. Thank you so much for sharing. That leaves us with Darren Dick, if you'd like to share your thoughts on the question as well.
Yeah, Nikita might be able to talk more to this later as well, but there's a lot of polling around support for a Human Rights Act, and Amnesty's done a lot of that polling, which shows really high levels of support for a Human Rights Act. I think it sits at about 80+% of the community, possibly higher. But one of the interesting findings too is that a lot of people also think we already have human rights protections in Australia, so they don't actually realise that we don't have these protections in place. And that's one of our biggest challenges for people to understand, is that we don't have the protections that we need. In terms of how it impacts children, I think it's in very profound ways. The support that you could get through a Human Rights Act. If you look to areas like social security and welfare, for example, there have been a number of programs in that space. There was a program called the Parents Next program that started as a program to assist and support single parents, turned into a really nasty sort of punitive program that affected single parents and their children. Welfare debit cards has been the only way that you can access welfare primarily for Aboriginal people, but for others as well. There's a range of different issues, and of course robo-debt is probably the most notorious of these issues, where having a human rights lens over is this breaching people's rights? Is it proportionate? Is it something that's justifiable? Are there better ways of doing it? Because that's what the lens is, would have made quite a significant difference. And I was looking at a case today. It was under the Queensland Human Rights Act from about 2 years ago, where there was the mother and her child, and they were in a violent situation, and they fled that violent situation, were able to find alternative housing, and the mother applied to homeschool the child, and under the Queensland Education Act, to do that you have to apply to some sort of Board of Studies or whatever it's called in Queensland, and one of the requirements, you have to provide your address. Now, she wasn't able to provide her address because it was frankly dangerous for her to provide her address, because she's in a situation where she's escaping a violent situation, and the request to homeschool the child was declined. Now, they took an action under the Queensland Human Rights Act, which applies to that Board of Studies and the Education Department, and ultimately the tribunal in Queensland found that they had not taken into account the rights of the woman and the child to be free from violence, and to live in safety in making their decision, and the decision was overturned, and those arrangements were put into place. So it's often really practical ways like that. When you look at some of the cases and the situations under Human Rights Acts, it's it might be a person in an aged care facility who's in a room where they won't provide a shower curtain, and they want a shower curtain to protect their dignity. It's about women and children being safe from violence. Often I in a separate role, I'm the chair of a community legal centre that the Welfare Rights Centre that is there to protect people in the social security system. Often what happens, women fleeing violence, they can end up being in breach of their Centrelink conditions because they might have and they might be on a pension or whatever that is sort of tied to the fact that they're in a relationship. And part of the violence that is perpetrated against them is often the partner then dobs them into Centrelink for breaching their terms because they're no longer in the relationship, so they're getting the wrong payment. And we end up with women being subject to penalties and all sorts of stuff through the social security system. They come to centres like ours to assist them, but these are human rights issues, and these are issues that get resolved through human rights acts when they generally are not being resolved very well in the way the systems operate at the moment. So the benefits are very tangible for children at that very personal individual level, and then at that broader level that when there are laws that are being developed and policies that actually affect children, then of course they should be involved because they've got views on what should happen and what's most effective to protect them.
Great, thank you so much, Darren Dick. That was a very beautiful response. I'm going to move on to the next question now. Do you believe that Australia's current legal framework provides adequate protection for human rights? If not, where do you think the gaps exist? For this one, I think I'd like to get Darren Dick, if you'd like to start off with this one, if that's okay with you.
Sure. So sorry to sound like a broken record, but we done this major project called Free and Equal, which the fundamental question for that project was, what should a national human rights system look like? What protections does it need? And what we proposed, which we put out prior to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, looking into whether Australia should have a new human rights framework, is we put out a proposal for what that should look like. It was very much what was the focus of that inquiry for the 12 or so months that it was underway. They reported to the Federal Parliament in May last year, and they very much endorsed what we'd said. We've said that there's essentially 8 areas that need protection, that Australia needs a dedicated human rights framework, that there needs to be, first of all, a reform of our federal discrimination laws. As I said, they're very out of date. They don't protect people adequately, and there are gaps in protection. There's no protection on the basis of religion, for example, or lack of religion either. We also have exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act that enable religious institutions to discriminate against LGBTI people that have been in place since the 1980s. They don't meet community standards anymore. So there's a range of reforms that need to happen. So that's one area. We say that there's a general lack of human rights education, both in the community and among public servants as well. So it's difficult for people to act consistently with human rights if they don't really know what they are or how to do that. And there's a serious and urgent need for better human rights education. We also don't think there's sufficient measurement around human rights. So we've proposed that there should be a national human rights index. So something the Commission would do. Every 3 to 4 years, we would put out some reporting which would say, how are we travelling on human rights? Who's experiencing human rights abuses? Are we moving forward? Are we moving backwards? It would be an objective framework that would hopefully take some of the politics out of it as well, because you'd be talking about the facts and figures. But as you know, it's a saying that if you don't measure it, you don't get any action on it, and that is a real problem in the human rights space. So that's our third area. The fourth then is that we think the government should actually tell the community what it's committed to. They should have every year an annual statement to Parliament setting out the government's priorities on human rights and accountability for what they actually did over the course of the year. Now, they do this in the Close the Gap process. So there's an annual Close the Gap statement to Parliament where the government will get up and say whether they're moving forward or backwards across key areas of disadvantage for First Nations people and what they're doing to improve the situation. They should be doing that for all human rights at the end of the day. We also think Parliament needs to better consider human rights. They're just, at the moment, there's not sufficient focus in the Parliament on human rights, which would also sit alongside that. We then think you need a strong Human Rights Commission, and that means proper funding, proper resources, proper functions, and similarly, our sixth one is a strong civil society as well. So support for NGOs to protect human rights. So the obligations as human rights law sit with government, but everyone has a role. Business has a role, educators have a role, everyone has a role. So, that there should be a plan to support that, to make our protection of human rights better. So that's our sixth element. Our seventh is the role of Parliament being improved and more transparent. And then our eighth element, and the critical element and our most central element, is the Federal Human Rights Act. So across all those things, we just think it's really, I think what's happened, to keep it in really simple language, is that we just haven't done much to protect human rights in our legal framework. As I said, discrimination laws that go back nearly 50 years without being reformed. If you take an example, for example, and this is a terrible example, as in shocking, is under the Racial Discrimination Act. There's provisions. What they're meant to be about is when you have somebody coming into your home to provide care, there may be cultural considerations that you want somebody of the same race as you, for example, to do that. Or under sex discrimination laws, you might want somebody who's the same gender. So if you have a carer coming in or support worker coming in to assist you with showering, then you want to be able to choose, you're a woman, you want to choose a woman to do that, those types of things. But what those laws allow is essentially for people doing work in your home for you to choose their ethnicity. Now, that was set in place in 1975. We didn't have the NDIS. We didn't have in-home care, aged care provision, which are now the fundamental models for that. I don't think it's acceptable now to be able to say, I don't want a black person coming into my home to provide me support under the NDIS. It's not acceptable. That's what the discrimination laws say, because they haven't been changed for 50 years in that case, 40 years for sex discrimination, 30 years for disability discrimination, etc. So the whole system's kind of degraded and hasn't got the level of protection that it needs. And the fundamental missing piece is a Human Rights Act that would just create such a major uplift, and people would actually have obligations as public servants to know what human rights are. They'd be required to act consistently with those human rights in everything they do. And I think the difference you get from that's quite significant. So 3 and equal, check it out.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah Dick. I think I'll ask Nikita White if you'd like to respond to this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, agreeing with everything that Darren said, and I think what I mentioned in the first question, which is there are so many gaps, because even though we legislated anti-discrimination laws 50 years ago, we haven't legislated to protect any other rights that are contained in the International Covenant, civil political rights, and on economic and social and cultural rights. So there is, aside from where the High Court has said, we imply there's rights in the Constitution, like the right to freedom of political communication, which is a lot narrower than the right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. We really have so few protections. And I think one thing I have thought about a lot as we've campaigned for a Human Rights Act is how in Australia we often talk about human rights when we're in a crisis. So when we have the Aged Care Royal Commission and the Disability Royal Commission, the recommendations were to legislate human rights protections for people in aged care, maybe a Disability Rights Act. We're now hearing people talking about housing as a human right because there's a housing crisis. And there is that gap, as Darren mentioned, in thinking about human rights, making decisions to not abuse human rights, but also to actually take action to progress people's human rights and realize them when decisions are made. So we're not only thinking about human rights when something becomes a crisis. And I think that preventative aspect of a Human Rights Act is such a big gap, because there is so little to no onus on whether it's Parliament, public service, but also, I think Darren mentioned this as well, service providers who are providing a public service like aged care providers to think about people's human rights. And that's, as well as the tool to take action, I think the preventative measure of actually requiring we call it public authorities, government, parliament, public service, and so on, to think about human rights is a huge gap that we need to fill.
Thank you so much for that response, Nikita White. I think I'd like to ask Senator Payman to follow up on this question as well.
I think the 7 elements that Darren spoke about were on point. I think I'll just add, from a political point of view and what happens in politics and in that in our capital, a lot of the times it's due to just the lack of political will, where you would see a piece of legislation come forward and that would actually, there's appetite, there's groundswell momentum around it, but the government of the day is just too scared of taking a step forward, so they just don't want to touch it, and instead they shelve really good, much needed reform. And I'm thinking of the religious discrimination bill, where it had the vilification vilification protections, where obviously people from all races and backgrounds and faiths in particular who visibly stood out and looked different were going to be protected from being discriminated. Or another thing that comes to mind is the duty of care bill, like the fact that it's become this whole thing of, why can't we think about the next generation to come? Why can't we ensure that our environment and climate is left in a better state, or at least not degraded? And it shouldn't be passed on, the burden shouldn't be passed on to the next generation. And again, you see a lot of this politicking where political convenience seems to be preferred over doing what's right and what's needed. And I think another example would be the Al-Khatib versus Godwin 2004 case, where the High Court ruled that indefinite detention was lawful, even though the person may not have committed any crime. And judges knew that this was like an inhumane and absolutely, like, it was just arbitrary, but they just couldn't override Parliament. And having a human rights law or a Bill of Rights would actually give that protection. It will ensure that politicians, can't just come in and strip away fundamental freedoms. So, yeah, like I think it's so much, like, I'm not surprised that there's more than 80% of people out there who are keen and wanting to see a Human Rights Act or a Bill of Rights. And the fact that it's not, for lack of better words, it's not a sexy topic. And people don't talk about it as much. And so a lot of people assume, it's probably just, we all have our human rights. There's got to be a human rights law that preserves our, rights and ensures that it doesn't contravene international law. But it's not until you dig deep and you're like, oh, wow, we don't, and we should. Like, consultation, I think Nikita mentioned it earlier, like asking for basic consultation should not be controversial. Like consulting with certain groups, whether it's young people, whether it's minority groups, whether it's Indigenous communities, shouldn't be controversial, shouldn't be rocket science.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that response. I think that just leaves us with Taylor, if you'd like to share your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I would say considering our legal framework that the protections for human rights are far too implicit, as my fellow panelists have mentioned. There is very little protection for them within our constitution, and it only covers those which are deemed to be, the most important ones, even though the nature of human rights eliminates the concept that one is more important than the other, or that one could exist without the others. I would say that there needs to be more action in legislation, more pressure put on Parliament to make those decisions. There needs to be more events like this in the meantime, while we can't kind of build up that legal framework, because I think that it's really important to actually building up that legal framework to actually be educated on human rights. I know that a lot of people within YCS and YCW were quite shocked or confused or had lots of questions when we brought this about, not because they were opposing it necessarily, but because they just genuinely didn't know what their human rights were and didn't understand that they weren't protected. So I think it's really important for people to actually know what their rights are, how we can better protect them. And obviously, the end goal of all of this work would be a federal Human Rights Act. I think that a few of the other panelists also spoke about a lack of reform in terms of legislation, which is obviously a really important thing in ensuring that rights are protected in a way that is current and is actually serving society as it exists today.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for that response. I'll move on to the last question for all of you guys. And this one is kind of a follow-up from the last one. So, would a federal human rights act fix this issue, as in like the gaps that we explored in the last question? And I'd like to get Senator Payman to start this one.
Yes, I absolutely think that a Bill of Rights, and I think I mentioned it in my previous answer, that it definitely would address it, the issues that we're seeing that are so prevalent. It will bring that level of accountability. It will act as a deterrent within Parliament when, you see different parties or different politicians putting up bills that are contrary to just human rights in general. And so I think being able to have those elements will really assist in not just educating and spreading that awareness, but also empowering people to know what their rights are, and invite for that robust discussion, invite, that holistic approach. It's common sense. The fact that we don't already have it is quite disturbing to a certain extent. I know that there's been many of my colleagues who've tried previously to put things forward. I'm actually due to have a conversation with independent MP Andrew Wilkie, who in 2017 put up a Bill of Rights Act to Parliament, but unfortunately it was on the notice paper and then it got pulled a few months later without allowing for any debate. And that's where that political will needs to come forward. It's great to have momentum on the ground, but people inside those chambers who are making the decisions, those parties that are in power or in government, they need to be lobbied hard to say, this is the time. Like, what more are we waiting for? How many more incidents need to take place before we realize that this is turning into a national crisis? And it's a national shame that we actually don't have these protections in place. And, we've got states who've got state-based charters, human rights charters, like Queensland, Victoria, and I think it's the ACT. But why don't we have a national equivalent? Why aren't we working towards that? So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do. I know that we're approaching election time, but this is an issue that's very close to my heart, and I've had multiple meetings with the Commission, and we'll be working closely, hopefully, to do something big in the near future.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. I think maybe I'll get Taylor to go second, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, no worries. Just to echo what Senator Payman said, yes, this Federal Bill of Rights would address the gaps in our current legal framework in the protection of human rights. And I think that it's really important in terms of people actually understanding what their rights are, that these rights are outlined explicitly in our legal framework to ensure that there is protection, that there is accountability, and that there is a deeper understanding of what our rights actually are as Australian citizens.
Great, thank you so much, Taylor. Darren Dick, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. So a Human Rights Act, it would be an act of the Parliament, so it's an ordinary piece of legislation. So it doesn't necessarily override other laws. So it's not going to stop every abuse of rights, and we have to be clear on that. It's not a constitutional change, but what it is it's a guide, and it's also a statement that human rights matter and that government should act consistently with human rights, and that's the default position rather than the default being that rights don't matter and you can do whatever you want. So I think it would have a serious impact in deterrence and accountability, as Senator Payman said. But what's interesting is you may have seen recently new Queensland government, which has breached the Human Rights Act, lowering the age of criminal responsibility and introducing adult time for adult crime for juveniles that goes against the rights of children. They're not good developments, and that's in a jurisdiction that has a Human Rights Act. But they had to do something when they did that. That is, they had to stand up in Parliament and say, we acknowledge that we are breaching the rights of children and we choose to do it. That's what they had to do. You didn't have a Human Rights Act. You don't say that. It's incredibly powerful. It doesn't stop them doing it straight away, but it makes it very clear that that's what they're choosing to do. And it's been interesting to watch some of those debates in Queensland because they've gone in a lot of different directions. And I think the fact that you had a Human Rights Act made those discussions a lot more intense, and made them a lot more uncomfortable for government than they otherwise would have been. So even though that's in, you would hope, your 1% of situations where you're not going to get the protection, but even in that situation, it puts a massive spotlight on that government and makes it very difficult for them to do that because they have to explicitly say, we've chosen a path which breaches rights. We could have done it differently, but we choose to breach children's rights, which is an appalling thing for a government to say. But I think generally, I don't want to sort of leave an impression that it wouldn't work because I think it would have a very significant effect. And if you think of recent royal commissions in Australia on veteran suicide, for example, the Disability Royal Commission, Robo-Debt Royal Commission, a lot of what's in those inquiries are things that were avoidable if you were protecting human rights. Robo-Debt in particular, if you had the protections in place, you would have had a legal pathway for people to be challenging those things in ways that didn't exist in the Robo-Debt scheme. The Disability Royal Commission, they recommended that there be human rights protections. Now, they were limited in their terms of reference, so they recommended it just for the disability community, but they essentially took the Human Rights Act model of the Commission and the PJCHR and said, do this for people with disability, they need this protection. So they saw that as one of the primary ways of protecting people with disability from violence. So it would have made a difference. And Senator Payman talked about the Al-Kateb case from 20 odd years ago that found that the mandatory and indefinite immigration detention, where people are just put into immigration detention forever, was found legal back 20 plus years ago. Several High Court judges since that time, Michael McHugh, Virginia Bell, she was recent Chief Justice of the Court, have both said we would have decided decisions about immigration detention differently if there'd been a Human Rights Act. That's incredibly powerful to know that that's what the most preeminent judges in Australia are saying. We didn't have this tool to make that change. And if we did, we would have decided things differently. But finally, I think I just want to emphasise that I think its major impact is in the day-to-day lives. It's, as I said, it's the person in aged care who wants a shower curtain, who There are cases of people who in aged care who are separated from their husband or their wife, and the policies of the aged care facility said they can't have a double bed and sleep together, and those sort of issues get dealt with. And they might seem really minor, some of these issues, but they're pretty major for the people who they affect. And so that's where I think its major work is to be done. It won't be in the courts. There'll be some action in the courts. There'll be occasional sort of, embarrassments for Parliament and the like, but it'll actually be in the day-to-day lives that people get better protection, where at the moment they're stuck and they don't know where to go and how to get help. And they live with things that are don't protect them, that lack dignity and lack respect, and shouldn't be the case.
Great, thank you so much for that response. That was amazing. I think that just leaves us with Nikita White to answer this one.
Yes. So again, I will back up what everyone else has said. I think what we tend to say is Human Rights Act will help fix the human rights issues facing people in Australia today by preventing human rights abuses, because it requires the government, whether it is Parliament, and obviously, as Darren mentioned, it's not a panacea when it comes to Parliament. They are democratically elected and we have to respect the democratic process, but it would put more of an onus on Parliament to consider human rights and to actually have to say we are abusing human rights in this situation. But it puts an onus on Parliament, on the public service, on departments, and particularly on those agencies that are providing a public service to consider human rights abuse. And it should prevent human rights abuses by, at that early stage of the process, people saying, hang on, this abuse is a human right, let's do it differently. But it also provides an avenue where there is a failure and where there is a human rights abuse, there is an avenue available to people to take action, whether that is in court, but we know most people don't want to go to court over these sorts of things. They want to be supported to raise it directly with their aged care provider or with their school, or to go to the Human Rights Commission and to conciliate their problem there. They will have a tool to do that if we have a Human Rights Act, and they will have remedies for the abuses they suffer. The other aspect that we think this would help address the issue is with education. Again, as I think everyone has mentioned, as Darren mentioned earlier, what we know from our polling is 51% of people think we have a Human Rights Act. People get very confused when they hear about anti-discrimination laws and so on. They think their human rights are protected, and they also do not know what to do if they suffer a human rights abuse. So really important education of the general public about what human rights are, what you can do if you suffer a human rights abuse, but not only of the general public, also of the public service, of service providers and of Parliament, and really think that would be transformational long-term in how this country approaches human rights. I wanted to share, we are part of the Human Rights Act coalition, which is 130 organizations who want a Human Rights Act. And that coalition has produced 101 examples of how states with Human Rights Acts have those acts have made people's lives better. And they also released a report last week on the right to housing, and that includes how there are 50 jurisdictions around the world that have protected the right to housing. And so there's examples of that in that report of how those jurisdictions have realized people's rights to housing. And so I will share them in the chat because I think they're really worth having a look at the concrete examples of how this can make a difference in people's lives.
Great, thank you so much. Also, just thank you so much to all the panelists that we've had. Now I'm just going to jump into the specific questions for each of you. We've got about 8 minutes until we need to jump into the next section. So I'll start with the question for Senator Payman. What progress has the federal parliament made in passing a Bill of Rights?
Just trying to unmute myself. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the only progress that actually made some sort of substantive addition to the notice paper was a 2017 Bill of Rights by independent MP Andrew Wilkie. I know that the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Human Rights recently presented a report, I think March of last year, but nothing's been done. So again, it's just a matter of time before the government goes into caretaker mode before the 2025 election, which needs to take place before 17th of May this year. And that being said, the Australian Human Rights Commission are doing an incredible job talking to as many parliamentarians and keeping this an alive topic as much as they can, knowing that whatever the outcome of the election, ideally we would want a progressive minority government or majority or whatever, but a government that's got the political will to be able to really push for a human rights act. We know that all the independents and crossbench senators, from my understanding, are all on board, whether they look at it from an angle of keeping out government overreach and protecting privacy, or whether it's about, whistleblower protections and giving freedoms to press and everyday Australians out there. I think a lot of work needs to be done depending on what the outcome of the election is. But that's where, I guess, minor parties and independents play such a crucial role in this election to make sure that we hold the government of the day to account and really push for solid reforms like this, and make sure that it's not just something that they shelve. Like we're sick and tired of inquiries happening, all these consultations taking place, but then these reports just collect dust because nobody really wants to open it up and have the conversation. I mean, it was independent MP Helen Haynes who actually suggested a National Anti-Corruption Commission a long time ago. And it wasn't until, the Labor Party in opposition were like, you know what, that's not a bad idea. We'll go into the election with that. And they did. And people were like, hell yeah, we want that accountability. We want transparency. We want, our heads of government and agencies to be held accountable for any allegations of corruption. So it was, independents and minor parties have pretty good ideas. The government of the day just needs to listen and realize that we're here to improve the lives of Australians. We're not here just because we've got nothing better to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much for elaborating on that one, Senator Payman. So for the next question, this one will be for Darren Dick. So can you tell us a little bit about what the Australian Human Rights Commission does and also their responsibility around the breach of human rights?
Yeah, sure. And if I could just add to Senator Payman's comments, I think that everything she said is absolutely spot on, that the PJCHR, the Parliamentary Committee report, and the Commission's Free and Equal report now have both been sitting with government for a little while. Our former president gave a press club speech last year where we basically challenged the government and said to them, everything you need to do to reform human rights is sitting in front of you on a silver platter, and all you need is the political will to do it. And this election is very important to whether that happens or not. And Senator Payman's dead right that all the Teal independents, the Greens, other independents, they are all very committed to this, and they may well have a very significant say on it, which means that the discussions on the Human Rights Act may not be very far away, depending on what happens in that election. But more broadly on the role of the Commission, I mean, there's a couple of different roles, so I'll try to keep it really super brief. So one is there are discrimination laws, and people can bring complaints to the Commission that their rights have been breached, and that role for us is an impartial, independent role. So we're about bringing the parties together to try and resolve it. We're not making decisions or anything, we're conciliating it. And then if those matters resolve, then they resolve. If they don't, we issue notices that they were unable to be resolved, and then people can go to court to resolve those matters. That's a very significant part of our work. Kind of separate from that, and there's no role of these two things together. We have commissioners, so 7 commissioners and a president who are statutory officers there to promote human rights. And you'll know about our sex discrimination, race discrimination, age discrimination, disability discrimination, Indigenous social justice, children and human rights commissioners, and our president who do that. And their role is very much an advocacy role. It's about analysing where there need to be better protections of human rights and advising government of that. So we report to Parliament, we engage with parliamentary committees all the time, and that's where our advocacy for a Federal Human Rights Act has come from with our Free and Equal project. It's where reforms to sex discrimination laws came from with our Respect at Work and Set the Standard work, and it's where sitting before Parliament and government again right now is our proposal for a national anti-racism framework as well. Saying we don't think Australia deals with race issues well enough and it needs a coordinated approach to that. So that's in our commissioner advocacy role. And then we have a broad education and awareness raising role about human rights as well. The final bit of our role is that there's a set of international standards that have been agreed through the United Nations. They're called the Paris Principles, and they essentially set out what an independent, robust Human Rights Commission looks like. And so we go through in a process every 5 or 6 years to be assessed as to whether we have the sufficient basis to be considered an independent, robust national human rights institution. And if we are, we're rated A status. Now, we're an A status institution. What that means is that separate to the government and separate to NGOs, we have rights to participate in UN human rights processes to put an independent view of the human rights situation in Australia. So we will often participate in processes under UN treaties and in the Human Rights Council and in other forums to put a view, sometimes contrary to the view the government puts about how human rights are going and what needs to be done. And one thing in that work is that coming up in January next year is a very significant process called the Universal Periodic Review, where every other country in the world will make recommendations to Australia on how it should improve its human rights record. And the centre of our involvement in that process will be pushing for a Federal Human Rights Act and a new national human rights framework as well. So that's kind of in a thumbshot the work. We have a massive work program. We're running over 40 different research and consultation and other projects all at the same time through those 7 commissioners.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that response. It was very insightful. Now the last one is for Nikita White. So could you please tell us a little bit about Amnesty International's campaign regarding a federal Bill of Rights?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I feel like similar to what the other people on the panel have said, our focus has been since the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights report was released last year and recommended legislating a Human Rights Act. We've been campaigning for the government to accept that legislation, to accept that recommendation, to commit to legislating a Human Rights Act. We have not seen that acceptance and commitment. But we are hopeful. There is, as Senator Payman said, a lot of support in Parliament. We don't know what will happen at the election. We don't know what the next government or Parliament will look like. But we know in the Parliament now, if Labor were to commit to legislating a Human Rights Act, the numbers are there to pass a Human Rights Act. And if we have a Parliament that looks something like the one today, with a minority Labor government, with a progressive crossbench, with a majority Labor government, with a progressive crossbench in the Senate, that we will be able to pass that act. And so that is what we're calling for the government to do. We don't expect we're going to get a commitment before the election. It is very busy at the moment in the political landscape, as it always is. But the election is a really important opportunity for, as Senator Payman mentioned, people to show what they want. Politicians should always be listening to people. We are their constituents. And a lot of them do, a lot of the time, I have to say. But an election is a particularly important time to shape the agenda going into the next parliament, and for all of us to be out there and saying to our current MPs and senators, but also to candidates, that we support a Human Rights Act. And so we're really focused on that over the next few weeks and months. Working with young people is one of our key focus areas. We're hoping to do a panel a bit like this one closer to the election about a Human Rights Act, but also human rights of young people more generally. We'll be working with people to meet their MPs, senators, and candidates to say, do you support and will you commit to supporting a Human Rights Act? And it is really important that this comes from people, not just from organizations like Amnesty. We know, the government knows that Amnesty wants a Human Rights Act, and so does the Human Rights Commission. We do know from our polling that there is strong support, 76% in our last poll of people who want a Human Rights Act legislated. It's actually only 3% of people who oppose a Human Rights Act. So it's really important to show MPs that support and build that groundswell of support, particularly in the election. And then, we'll reassess. And after the election, if there is that opportunity to get this legislated, it's going to be a really important moment to push for a commitment and for a Human Rights Act to be legislated. The other thing I wanted to add was around another part of our campaign, and something that's come up a bit today is the fact that people don't think we have a Human Rights Act. About 51% of people think we already have one. So a key part of our campaign is raising awareness through events like this, to say, and more broadly, if there's anything we can do to support you in your work, talking to young people about what a Human Rights Act would do, the fact that we don't have one, why it's important to the issues impacting young people today. I'm always really happy to have a chat and to see how we can walk together going forward, and to hopefully build that groundswell of support, and to see that in not too long our human rights are protected in our laws. And the last thing I did want to add, I can't remember if I did before, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights report that recommended legislating a Human Rights Act, that's a Labor-led committee. So we're really hopeful they will accept that recommendation, but we know it won't happen unless there's pressure on them. There's a lot of things they have to address and they need to prioritize. And so they need to know this is important to people. And that's why this moment is really important.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of you guys for being part of the panel and for sharing some amazing, insightful views. I think we've all learned a lot here today. We're very grateful. So this leads us into the negotiation part, which Sudeep will lead for us. So if you'd like to take it away, Sudeep.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you to our panelists as well. Thank you for all your answers. And now comes the interesting bit. So we've kept this a bit in a bit of suspense and didn't give you time to prepare for this section for a reason, unlike the panel list interview section. And essentially, I'll go into a little bit more about what we're going to be doing now. But the nature of a webinar is that it is a webinar. Many people can't attend or may not know about the event in time to attend. However, we want permanent results driven from this webinar, especially since we have such an amazing group of panelists here to help us with that today. So we want this to become a key issue in the upcoming election, and the public should know about what was discussed here today. To do that, we have Joe Magri, who you might be able to see here under the Australian YCW account. He's been taking notes throughout this entire webinar. He's the Australian YCW national mentor, a manager at Jesuit Social Services, and a lawyer himself. So as I've been saying, he's been taking notes throughout this webinar, and essentially we will push to publish whatever outcomes we get from this webinar as articles in news publications, both local and national, especially with Joe's help and his media contacts. Another note, which I probably should have stated earlier, but this Zoom is currently being recorded. which you'll be able to see as a message that popped up when you first joined. And our social media team will also be publicizing the results of this webinar on social media platforms and our social accounts. Nikita's briefly mentioned that before the election, parties may be too busy to look into this issue, but also stressed the importance of highlighting it. And we believe the same thing. The purpose of both these follow-up actions is so that we can have the everyday Australian know where the politicians who are here today stand on this issue, but also, just as importantly, so that they question their local members about a Human Rights Act. With that being said, over this next section, a short section of negotiation, we want commitment from our panelists to fight or continue fighting for a Human Rights Act. I'll be going around and asking each of you one by one the following 2 questions, which are also displayed on the screen. Firstly, do you support passing a federal Human Rights Act? Which I think's been answered pretty well after our conversation today. But secondly, what will you or your organization be doing to further this cause over the next few years? So I think we'll start with Senator Payman.
Thank you, Sudeep. And I wish everyone did something like this, had a negotiation and pledges right at the end of the forum, because, yeah, that accountability is important. I 100% support passing a federal Human Rights Act. You can write that, you can have it plastered everywhere and remind me when the time comes. And what will I do? Well, through Australia's Voice and the work I do within public advocacy, within public forums, I'll definitely be raising awareness. I will be working closely with the Australian Human Rights Commission to ensure that the messaging is concurrent with their research, to ensure that the way we're communicating this to everyday Australians is consistent, and that we keep lobbying and pushing whoever the government of the day is to make sure that this is a priority.
Thank you so much, Senator Payman. Next, I'd like to ask Nikita.
Yes, absolutely. Probably to no one's surprise, I do support passing a federal Human Rights Act, and I know I speak for everyone at Amnesty International Australia. In terms of what we're doing, I did, outlined a bit of that before, but something I wanted to hone in on is we are trying to build up people to show their support for a Human Rights Act, to raise awareness of the fact that there isn't one, and particularly to build that groundswell of support in the public. And so we want to be working with other organizations wherever possible to push that forward. And we're really particularly interested in working with young people, which is why I was really excited to be coming tonight, because there are, going back to what I said at the beginning, so many issues that impact young people that a Human Rights Act will address, and it's so important. Given the future people face is uncertain, I think it's really safe to say we live in scary times, for young people to have a tool they can use to take action if they suffer human rights abuses. And so I wanted to specifically say that we want to further our engagement with young people and organizations representing young people, so that the conversation about a Human Rights Act, young people are in that conversation and they're part of it and they're consulted on it. And, I'm meeting with politicians and part of that campaign. And so not only wanted to commit to, furthering the cause through the work we're doing with MPs and our petition and all those sorts of things, but particularly to work with young people to progress this campaign.
That's absolutely awesome. Thank you, Nikita. Next, I'd like to ask Darren.
Thanks. So, I've been involved in advocacy and work that the Human Rights Commission, I've been the Commission for a long time. I've been involved in our advocacy on this for many, many years, including not just this round, the Brennan National Consultations 2009, when we came very close to getting a Human Rights Act. It's been a good 17, 18 years of work since then for us to get back to this position we're in now. So so highly committed to it, and it's a very significant missing piece for us in Australia. What are we doing? We're working a lot with Amnesty. We're working with the Human Rights Law Centre and with the Campaign for Human Rights Act. We work very closely together and terrifically. It's been very important, and I'd really encourage you and your organisations to sign up on the Human Rights Act campaign as well. The more organisations we have who are signed up to that, the better. Similarly, the Commission's sort of doing a lot of engagement with different kind of sectors in the community. So we have a forum for businesses on the Human Rights Act. We have one with disability organisations, youth-focused organisations. We do have one with some national NGOs looking at a Human Rights Act. We've been doing similarly, we've had a lot of recs in our race framework work and work with ethnic communities and First Nations communities. And a really interesting piece of work we're doing for our Age Discrimination Commissioner is with older persons and various organisations who work with older people, and very much looking to a model of a set of sort of elders who would sort of be able to speak to why the future of Australia, the Human Rights Act is important. So there's a lot of things we're doing to do that, as well as a very extensive program of engagement in Parliament, as Senator Payman said in meeting with her today. And I think we've had 110 meetings with politicians in the last 3 or 4 months. So it's been quite an extensive program. And then, as I said, the Universal Periodic Review, the next major international review, will be participating. Although actually there's 2 other. Australia is appearing before the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights in September, which is one of our major treaties, and the preparation work for our appearance before the Civil and Political Rights Committee is also happening in April this year. So we'll be doing a lot of the international engagement to back this up as well. But it has been for a number of years and continues to be the #1 priority for the Human Rights Commission.
Thank you so much, Darren. That's absolutely awesome. And yeah, for sure, we'll look into joining the Human Rights Bill or NGO coalition as well, as you've suggested. And finally, Taylor, I know we're springing this on you, but what about you? How would you commit to a human rights bill personally and through the YCS/YCW?
I, of course, being a part of the YCS and YCW in the creation of this webinar, support the passing of a Federal Human Rights Act. Personally, I have made a very big commitment to educating myself a lot about international law, about NGOs, about legal framework, and about how all of those coincide with human rights through my education and obviously for my own interest, being an advocate. Through YCS and YCW, my main priority as the YCS national representative is ensuring that all members of YCS and YCW understand, firstly, what their rights are educated and feel supported to speak out about protection for those rights. And even though I'm only 17, I aim to wield my political and advocate contacts for the better. And I apply as much pressure as I can on those contacts to make real legislative change.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, everyone, for those commitments. And we promise you that those commitments will be followed up upon with all of you after this federal election's over. So again, thank you very much for those commitments. We have solid, concrete statements and agreements from everyone now. You can't back out anymore. But again, yes, really, thank you so much. And we'll give the next minute or so for audience to put questions they may have to the panelists in the chat. And we'll go over those.
Sorry, guys, I have another event to go to in the next half an hour, so I will have to jump off. But if there are any questions to me, I'm happy for Sudeep to send it via email and I can get it back to you guys, and Sudeep can circulate it. But thank you so much for having me. And sorry I couldn't stay till the end.
All good. Thank you, Senator, for joining us.
Take care. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
So to the panelists who are still here, we'll give it maybe a minute or two so we can let questions flow in before we get to asking you them. Maybe take a short break, and I'd suggest drinking some water. I know we've been making you talk a lot over the past hour or so.
Nikita and I are used to talking under concrete about a Human Rights Act, so you don't need to worry.
It's very true.
Well, we've got a few to start with, so maybe we'll start with those. Firstly, from Miranda, in the absence of a Human Rights Act, how do we ensure that Australians are properly educated about their rights and the importance of human rights protections in our society? So I'll throw that out to any of the panelists who'd like to answer.
I can start if you want, Nikita. I mean, a lot of our focus with this work over the last few years has been about creating what we call a rights-mindedness, which is by having that sort of framework in place, you sort of create a central way of people knowing what their rights are. So at the moment, rights, they're set out in a bunch of international agreements. As Nikita said, there's some, but limited implied protections through the Constitution. There's discrimination laws. It's kind of a little bit all over the place. And one of our arguments too is it's just not actually very comprehensible. It's not very easy for people to know what their rights are. You might have seen there's been a lot of media in the last 4 or 5 days about results from tests around Year 10 students' understanding of civics in Australia and parliamentary processes and the like, and expressing a lot of concern that it's very low and lower than it should be. So we do have a general challenge, I think, around people's understanding of democracy and rights and how they fit into that. The Commission does have a role in sort of educating people about rights. It's a role that's basically not funded by government and hasn't been for a long time. And as I said, one of our key pillars is that not only should there be a Human Rights Act and discrimination law reform, but there has to be a really fundamental commitment to human rights education in Australia. Excuse me. And that includes at the broad community level, as well as in schools, as well as in Parliament, in our public service and across businesses and a whole lot of different settings. And it's obviously easier to do that if you have laws that basically create consequences if you act inconsistently with human rights, or if it's, for example, places a legal duty on public servants that they must consider human rights. It's harder to do that in absence of that, but we still do. We still do some things that relate to that, but we do a lot less than we would like to do. We simply don't have the resources to do as much as we would like to do. So we're more limited to some of the other functions I talked about as a commission, with our commissioners doing national inquiries and inquiring into sort of major issues and raising issues in that way.
And I would just share that we are very supportive of more funding for human rights education. And it has sadly been underfunded and under-resourced for a really long time. But I will also share, we have an international human rights education website with lots of resources on international human rights and on, what it means for them to be respected and protected. And I think we have lots. I think human rights education can be as simple as sharing social materials that explain what human rights are and why they're important. And we're always producing lots of them. So really do look out for them. I know we and a lot of other organizations do a lot of explainer blogs and so on about human rights, including things that are happening in Parliament. So I think always look out for them. And yeah, it's a really hard, it's a hard question because it's something that a Human Rights Act would help. Having a Human Rights Act would help with education. But without that act in place and that commitment to education, there's still ways we can take action.
Thank you both. Next, how does Australia's lack of a human rights act compare with other democratic countries such as the UK or Canada? And what lessons can we learn from their experiences?
I'm happy to jump in about one particular lesson I've had while talking to my colleagues at Amnesty International UK who have a Human Rights Act. But that act has been under attack for a really long time. Thankfully, the current government, are supportive of a Human Rights Act, but previous governments were attempting to repeal the Human Rights Act. And one thing I learned from talking to them, they spoke about their campaign for a Human Rights Act and the fact it was led by a lot of lawyers. And they don't think they built up the support in the public before it was legislated. And what they have seen when governments attempt to repeal the Human Rights Act is people don't want it, right? Because, say, why do you support the government taking away your right to an education? People will always say no. But it is important to build that support amongst the general public to have that education in whatever way we can do it. And that's why that's an important part of our campaign, because we want a Human Rights Act and we want people to be able to use it when we get one and to be supporting it. And so we know they're really tricky to repeal because, people want their human rights protected. But that's definitely a lesson we've learned from talking to our colleagues at the UK. And the other, I just wanted to mention about other democratic countries, particularly the Right to Housing report I shared earlier. I think it was great to see how many countries have protected the right to housing and have adopted human rights-based housing strategies. And they have used the right to housing and the fact that everyone should have a right to housing to shape their housing policies. And Canada has adopted that. Currently, Scotland is a great example, Wales that's featured in the report, but also Finland. Finland's probably the best example of how you can use human rights as a basis for policy to really transform an issue. It's taken 30 years in Finland, but homelessness has decreased by 80%. That's really significant. It's the only country in Europe where homelessness is decreasing. And so I think we have a lot to learn about how other jurisdictions have managed to put human rights at the center of policies to achieve, it's not an overnight solution, but to solve problems that really plague us, especially when we're looking at what's happening in housing in this country at the moment.
Thank you, Nikita.
A very quick answer from me on that one too is that, of course, Australia has is within the British sort of legal tradition, and a country is colonised by Britain. Every other country in the Commonwealth has a Human Rights Act, so we're an outlier for not having these protections in place. And my 4 or 5 word, I didn't count how many I was going to say, lesson that we learned from this is that Human Rights Acts work and they make a difference.
Thank you, Darren. And that really, really highlights how imperative it is that we need to pass this act and bill as soon as possible. Now, I know we're running out of time and I don't want to eat into any of your or the audience's time tonight or afternoon, depending on where you are. So we'll be a little more selective with the next few questions. This next question I really empathize with, because before the national social media ban, NSW and the South Australian governments held a joint committee of sorts and a social media summit where they invited youth delegates, advocates, advisors to attend and try and form that social media ban policy. I was lucky enough to go to that event, and this was an issue that I and many others kept bringing up again and again, and I think is really important, especially in passing a federal human rights bill too. How do we strike the right balance between protecting human rights and avoiding judicial overreach? particularly in situations where the Act could potentially conflict with parliamentary sovereignty?
I'm happy to have a first go at that. I mean, the issue is that a Human Rights Act is an act of the Parliament. So it doesn't breach parliamentary sovereignty because it's an act of the Parliament. It's an effort. It is Parliament expressing its sovereignty. There is a general sort of interpretive principle that says if the Parliament makes a law, a later law that is in conflict with an earlier law, that the later law is taken to be the definitive view on the issue. If it is expressly if that is expressly expressed, or if there's any room for ambiguity, you take that sort of more favourable interpretation, and there's a principle of legality which applies to that as well. I didn't say that very well, but talking about the principle of legality. But really, the Human Rights Act, what it does is it's Parliament stating that human rights have to be considered by all, and then it gives roles to the Parliament, it gives roles to the public service and the executive, and it gives roles to the court. And so the court does have a legitimate role to interpret human rights, and we say that should be based on all the international treaties and all the international jurisprudence that sits underneath them, as well as domestic Australian law. So they have a really valuable role in guiding and providing an understanding of what human rights are. Now, at the nub of human rights, there are some human rights, torture, right to life, etc., that are absolute rights. There are rights they're called non-derogable rights in the international law, which you cannot ever breach. It's fundamental, you cannot breach this right. But most rights are not absolute. So your right to freedom of expression is not an absolute right. Doesn't enable you, for example, to racially vilify somebody or to express racial hatred against them, etc. So there's a balancing exercise that has to happen here. And there's principles around interpretation that apply around proportionality and justification that apply. So the courts, they have an important role in interpreting those provisions and applying human rights to situations where there's a balancing of rights to make sure that the balance is appropriate as well. So and occasionally, Parliament's not going to like it, but at the end of the day, under the Human Rights Act model that's out there, because it's not a constitutional model, it's an act of Parliament, the courts will occasionally, what they may well say is, we think that this law is inconsistent with human rights, but that won't overturn the law. It'll then leave it in a really uncomfortable space for Parliament where they're going to have to consider what they're going to do about it. Are they going to fix it once they're known? And there's quite complex provisions in the model of how you deal with that, but essentially it would require the Attorney General to notify Parliament that inconsistency has been identified by the courts, but it will ultimately be up to Parliament how it fixes that.
Thank you, Darren. The next question is from Mason. When discussing a Human Rights Act, a primary concern is how it would protect the Australian citizen. But how would it also protect the rights of more exploited minorities like immigrants, who, even if protected, are usually too afraid of speaking up for themselves?
I just wanted to add with the Free and Equal report and what the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights has recommended, it applies not only to Australian citizens, but anyone in Australia's care. And I think we believe that's really important for immigrants, people who are not Australian citizens, but particularly for people in offshore detention, for the Human Rights Act to apply to them, because they are people who we've spoken about, tonight, have been subjected to horrific human rights abuses by various Australian governments. And it's really important that their human rights are considered. I think in terms of people who are usually too afraid of speaking up for themselves, it's a really important consideration for advocacy and for organizations like ourselves, the Human Rights Commission, and others to figure out how we work with communities who are impacted by human rights abuses and may not feel safe to speak up. And I'm thinking a lot about the work that has happened here in Queensland with survivors of domestic violence in the Queensland Human Rights Act. And so Tenants Queensland has done a lot of work to support them. to realize their rights. Women who faced eviction because of the actions of their violent ex-partners, they've worked with them to lodge complaints. They didn't have to go to court. They didn't even have to go to conciliation. It was letters and lodging complaints with the housing providers so that this woman, in this particular case, could stay in her home with her family. And so I think it's on us and civil society and NGOs and so on to work with people to realize their rights safely.
And my quick addition on that question is the primary concern being how to protect the Australian citizen. That's not how I would frame a Human Rights Act. I would say the primary purpose is to ensure that every time the federal government, an official in the government, makes a decision that affects anyone through the exercise of power, they have to think about how they're impacting on people's human rights. So whether they're citizens or not, doesn't matter. It's more about if it's within the decision-making and the power of the Australian government, then it's a requirement on them to consider how they're impacting people's rights.
Thank you, Darren, Nikita. And even if I can just add to that, I think especially after a Human Rights Act passes and a few cases go through, it sets a certain political and legal precedent that helps empower others, even in minority groups who may be less confident in the protection of their rights, to step up and step forward. And our final Q&A question of tonight is from Lara. She was intrigued about the comment on the protection of religion. How would the Human Rights Act protect the freedom of religion, and where do its limits lie?
I can start with that one as well. So there's a long history of there's two sets of issues here. So the first one is we have discrimination laws. There is a gap in those laws to protect people on the basis of religious belief or it being atheist or not having any religious belief. Multiple governments now, I think going back to the possibly to the Gillard government, but definitely the Abbott government have proposed introducing religious discrimination protections. What's happened though is that in a lot of the debate around that, a lot of organised religious groups have also sort of sought for those discrimination protections to effectively be like a Human Rights Act and to protect their human rights more broadly. And it's led to a lot of controversy because then you get, for example, LGBTI groups saying, well, why would you just protect the rights of religious groups and not protect other rights and so on? And in many ways, what it does is it points to why you need a Human Rights Act, because then you have a comprehensive protection of rights for everyone in the community, and then you do the balancing exercise across all the rights. So you protect religious the right to religious expression, and then some of that you're entitled, that people have an absolute right to have a religion, to hold a religion, and to believe whatever they want. But it is subject to limitation, potentially, how you express that in the interaction with others. So the Human Rights Act gives you a way of balancing that and doing that. And it's kind of become a bit muddied because what governments have done over the last 10 years, that they've almost tried to make a religious discrimination act, not just a discrimination protection, but also a Human Rights Act for religion at the same time. And that's made it very difficult. The Commission has advocated that there should be religious discrimination protections, and they should just be pretty much the same as you get for sex discrimination, race discrimination, etc. And they follow that standard model of protection. And that is absolutely needed. And we're seeing that right now as a result of what's happening in the community. But then you also need protections of religious freedom in a Human Rights Act as well. So I think that's been the real difficulty at the moment. And unfortunately, because it's been so controversial, it means neither of those things have happened, and we don't have any of that protection. And you have very significant spike in anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian and anti-Arabic racism at the moment. Jewish groups are considered an ethnicity under the Racial Discrimination Act, so arguably they're mostly, if not fully, covered through the Racial Discrimination Act. But Muslims are not recognised as an ethnic group under the Act and are not protected sufficiently. I think there would actually be more protection for Jewish communities under a Religious Discrimination Act as well, actually, because they don't have to kind of fit it within an ethnic descriptor under the Racial Discrimination Act. So there's a real need for these protections to exist at the moment, but I think there's a bit of confusion that happens with trying to almost use a discrimination lens to provide a positive protection of human rights is the problem. Now that might sound really abstract, but to just explain it a tiny bit further, what it means if it's a discrimination protection is that you essentially then have exemptions in the discrimination law that says the following actions do not amount to discrimination. So it means that the expression of religious freedom gets defined as, you know, an exception to discrimination. So it's kind of the wrong way around. You kind of want to protect religious freedom rather than describe an expression of religious freedom as a form of discrimination that you're allowed to do or that's exempt from discrimination law. So it's a very complex, very messy debate. It's got really bogged down, and it's a real shame because the protections are needed for both. But we would say Human Rights Act is your best way to do it. And religious discrimination protections that are appropriately balanced.
I'm just going to second everything Darren said. Very well.
Thank you, Nikita. Thank you, Darren. And with that, we'll start wrapping up. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists who are here and also aren't able to be here at the moment. As you know, there's been a committee within the YCW who've been helping coordinate this event today, and especially the online aspect of our rights campaign over the past 4 months leading up to this webinar. Meaning today's event is not just something a few volunteers threw together in a couple of days. So I'd like to send out my thanks to them. Also, the same can be said of the Australian Human Rights Act. The idea of it has been in conception since 1981, when Tasmania's Attorney General proposed a constitution. He was quickly shut down. A Rights Act would have hindered the government from later making laws to discriminate against Indigenous Australians and Asian immigrants, such as the Immigration Restriction Act in 1901. This has been repeated again and again in regards to the Brennan Inquiry Committee, which was also not followed up on in 2009. And again, we hope that doesn't happen with the current parliamentary inquiry that just concluded in 2024. How many more times will we look back and see cases where a Rights Act could have protected someone? Yet still there's debates. This issue shouldn't be one that's been politicized. Human rights are a basic necessity and, in its irony, a right of humanity. An alarming statistic is that last December, our social media volunteers held a poll on our socials regarding what they knew about their human rights, and also if our followers even know that there's no legal protection for human rights. And 60% of followers said no. They didn't know that we had no Australian Human Rights Act, which is why we're absolutely delighted to see so many of you, YCW and YCS members, partner organization representatives, and members of the general public tune in tonight, both in person within the webinar and also viewing this afterwards through our clips and recordings. And we hope you take away something new, even if it's just the knowledge that's been shared tonight from our amazing panelists. And again, I'd like to reiterate what I've said and thank all our panelists, Nikita, Darren, Taylor, Senator Payman, and also Senator Thorpe, who wanted to be here but was unable to be here. You've really made this a great webinar, along with the tireless work of the volunteers behind this. I'll hand over to Yolanda.
Thank you. And if anyone in the audience found yourselves agreeing with the National Rights Act movement, that's in its third stage. Just know you aren't late to the party. If you're not yet a part of YCW or YCS, I'd like to personally invite you to sign up on our AYCW website as a member. It's free. We give you a platform to develop yourself as a leader and implement volunteering ideas with help from members in your city. The organization does lots of important work globally, as well as including having a special advisory status in the United Nations Economic and Social Development Council. If you're time poor, the least you can do is sign Amnesty's petition, the link of which was sent early in our Zoom chat, but is also currently on our screen. though most attendees already have. Please also follow our Instagram, also in the chat, where we will continue to post funny or informative stuff and what a rights act means for you as well. YCW has a very ambitious goal to increase our following by tenfold in the coming months so we can reach and inform more. And it's all made possible by you clicking that follow button. I'd like to thank the following people for their help organizing this webinar. So Sudeep as well for collaborating with me on this as well. Also for Gio, Val, Miranda, Taylor, Joe as well, and Ashish for always supporting and just doing so much. Like the amount of time you spend volunteering and being open has it's really made this the success that it is. So we are so grateful for all of you guys. With that, I'd like to conclude our webinar with the last thank you I was saving. That's for everyone who's attended. So thank you so much for being here tonight and supporting what we're trying to do here. So yeah, thank you so much, and I'll pass on to Sudeep to finish.
Thank you, Yolanda. I'd like to echo Yolanda's words again, and again thank our amazing panelists for being here tonight and sparing your time for us. And all the audience, thank you for attending. I would also like to specifically thank Valerie and Gio, our social media team, Taylor and Yolanda, who have helped organize this, and all of whom made our planning committee, Miranda for helping organize the event, and especially coming in clutch, helping get Senator Payman on board as of just this afternoon when Senator Thorpe dropped out, and also Joe and Ashish for their ongoing mentorship and support. Now, if there's any final takeaways, I encourage you, the audience who are here, and also watching this as clips later on, to sign the Amnesty International petition, join NGO and advocacy groups like the YCW, and ask your MPs and hold politicians accountable. What we have done today here is monumental, and it's absolutely amazing that all of you have been a part of this. We have not started a fight against not just started a fight, but continued one that's been going on for decades. A fight against institutional issues, and hopefully one that we win so society is free for the centuries to come. Thank you and good night. Please feel free to log off and enjoy your night.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you
you.
so much
Everyone for
having me.
joining. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Can I just ask the planning team to stay back for a bit?
All good.